What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Tower of Time. Now, real quick at the beginning of the video, I review games after 100% to set me apart from other reviewers on YouTube and to lend myself some credibility. You can find a link to my Steam profile down in the description below. It is public, feel free to check it out. These reviews do cover more than just the achievements though, and if you're curious everything that entails, if you go to my channel and you're not subscribed, first video you'll see will explain all of it. That said, Tower of Time is developed by a company called Event Horizon, who is now working on their second game, Dark Envoy. The reason I am checking this game out is actually because Dark Envoy looks very promising as a CRPG, which is a type of game that this particular channel happens to specialize in, really. And as such, I wanted to check out their previous work. Tower of Time is a pretty interesting blend of CRPG and TRPG, ultimately. However, it's also a bit of a dungeon crawler. The entire premise of the game, really, is that we are exploring the Tower of Time, as it turns out, which is made up of 11 floors, though the last one is pretty straightforward, so I would say 10 is probably a more realistic take. But the story setup for this game is that you are living in a dying world. Some event long ago has basically caused not exactly an apocalypse as things are still living, but everything is very hard right now and the land is just kind of dying. As a child, your character actually finds the Tower of Time after an earthquake sort of unearthed it. The Tower of Time is a giant upside down tower kind of lodged into the earth, and as a child you explore it, come in contact with a mysterious force that tells you to leave and come back as an adult, which you do after your life has led you to lead a band of troops. You're in command of several characters, if you will, who act as your scouts and explore the Tower of Time. The character described as you is never actually playable, so think of it more as you controlling the action, but the 7 predefined characters you'll ultimately get to play as are the ones actually doing all the work. So that's all I want to tell you guys about the story setup, because surprisingly, for a game like this, the story's actually pretty good. For a game that is ultimately just a dungeon crawler, especially in this manner, I was not going in with high expectations for the story, and while I wouldn't say the story is going to blow you away, like this isn't Planescape Torment or anything, I'm just surprised with how much they were able to do with it, because it is actually pretty engaging. That said, it is a dungeon crawler, so a lot of the story gets told to you through either dialogue or cutscenes. Basically, every floor has an actual cutscene that will play and explain more and more of the story, and again, it gets surprisingly interesting. Now, before we move on to the rest of this review, one last note on the story. This is speculation on my part, so not technically part of the review, but I thought it fit the video the most right here, so this is where I'm going to mention it. Given what I learned in Tower of Time, while Dark Envoy has not been pitched as a sequel or anything, I'm curious if they take place in the same universe, because there's actually a lot of themes that seem to line up with what I know about Dark Envoy. But again, that's just speculation. So back to the review. So from here, let's talk about difficulty. You actually have tons of options in this regard, including which part of the CRPG or TRPG spectrum you want to lean into. So when you fire up a game, you can actually pick between RPG and RPG Lite. RPG Lite actually removes most of the storytelling, so you can focus on the tower exploration and the combat, of course. And then RPG is just, your standard story. That's what you could consider the normal version of the game. And then there is Permadeath, which is an Iron Man mode, pretty standard stuff there. And then we have the actual difficulty options. This is from story to epic, and I would tell you that from here, Tower of Time has a wealth of difficulty options, and you should probably play around with them to find out what works for you. But I would tell you that as someone who plays and reviews these games, often on their hardest difficulty regularly, the epic difficulty of this game, which is required for some of the achievements, is incredibly hard. Thankfully, this game has been out for a while, and I was able to look up some strategies, etc., but I had a significant amount of trouble getting some of the epic difficulty achievements, as again, it's just quite hard. Now, for normal mode, which is what I would imagine most people are going to play the game on, the first couple levels are pretty challenging, but there does kind of come a point where your characters are really geared up and everything, and at that point you can kind of not pay as much attention to the strategy part of combat, which we'll talk a bit more about. Once you get to that point, everything outside of a boss fight really just wasn't that challenging. And then story mode is super easy. You basically just don't even have to play through the combat with any attention. You can kind of just autopilot and usually win. But from there, let's talk about gameplay. What does this thing actually look like? So, as I mentioned, we are going to, of course, be descending into the upside down tower. So while you are descending the tower, you are technically going towards the tower's top, if you will. And as we explore the 10 levels, which ultimately lead to the 11th level, we will be fighting all sorts of enemies. We will be exploring the tower as well. Each one of the levels, with there only being 10, is actually pretty extensive. All of them have little side quests. You can find loot, scrolls, which will actually give you permanent bonuses to some of your characters. You can find enchants, which will allow you to enchant your gear. You can find fountains, which were another form of permanent boost to a character. However, these also have the potential to be negative, but the fountains in particular, you don't know what they do until you use them. However, visually, you can always usually tell if it's bad. So if a fountain is glowing red, it's probably bad for your character, and I wouldn't recommend using it. Then we can pick up blueprints for the buildings, but we'll talk more about that in just a second. And naturally, with a game like this, there are small puzzles to be solved, but all of them were pretty straightforward. Nothing super annoying or anything like that. Though, to be fair, my tolerance for puzzles seems to be higher than most people's. Now, while you're exploring the tower, you will actually have access to a town of sorts. Now, this is basically just a 2D screen where you'll pick individual buildings and then they'll do something for you. Pretty standard stuff. I will say almost everything you can do in town, you can actually do inside the tower if you bring up the appropriate menu. So don't always think you have to come to town, but the main thing you need to come to town for is to train your characters, as leveling up works a bit differently in Tower of Time than other games, as experience points in this game is effectively just your gold, as you don't really spend gold on anything else. But in order to level up your characters, you first have to upgrade the associated building for them. There are 3 buildings associated with one of your 7 heroes. The blueprints you find in the tower will allow you to upgrade these buildings, which will then increase the potential max level for each character. And then when you have the appropriate amount of gold, you can take each of these characters to the barracks and then train them, which will then instantly give them a level. Now that said, beyond that, exactly the functionality of each of the town buildings does depend a little bit on the game mode that you picked, as RPG Lite kind of takes away some of the RPG elements associated with these buildings and kind of just lets you jump right into it, and it would seem kind of assumes you know what you're doing already, whereas on RPG mode, the game will kind of walk you through all this stuff so you're not lost. But essentially, town is where you're going to go to upgrade your buildings, level up your characters, and handle equipment, etc. You can teleport to town at any time from any point in the tower. You just click the town button at the top of the screen and you get teleported back. And then when you're ready to go back in the tower, which you get to by just clicking on the tower icon, it takes you right back to where you were on the floor that you choose to go back to. So it's very quick and instantaneous that way. Now from here, let's talk a bit more about character progression. Every time we level up one of our characters, they're going to get 3 attribute points and several skill points. This is going to allow you to build your character a bit. Now, the permanent boost you can find inside the tower will also add to this. Some of those permanent boosts include skill points and attribute points, etc. But there are only 4 attribute points to assign things to. Each character has basically 2 of these that they should really be putting things into. And each character has their own class. And it's usually pretty obvious. For instance, your tankier characters, you basically want to go might and life, which is going to make them hit harder and live longer. But there is a little bit of variance here, but not so much in the attributes, more in the skills actually, as each character has several skills they can choose from and they can only have 4 active at any time. And I will say that the skills portion of defining one of your characters does make it feel a little Diablo-y, which is especially prevalent when we get to the actual gear, because the gear system in this game is basically out of an ARPG. It's essentially random loot with affixes assigned, which then changes the base item, or at least the stats associated with it. However, there is a crafting system implemented in-game that makes it very easy to craft your own gear, and it is actually pretty easy to farm the affixes you want, as the crafting materials you essentially need are basically just crystals that you'll find in the tower and get for completing combat, etc. And you just get tons of them. You can dismantle gear to get more of them. It's just a very easy system to get into. So I wouldn't really worry about not being able to find loot that you need to continue. Now, if you're playing through the game on RPG mode, you'll eventually slowly get access to all 7 characters available to you. You'll start with 2 of them, and then you'll get more of them. If you start on RPG Lite, you actually just start with all of your characters ready to go. But while I could tell you about each individual character, each of them is kind of tied to the main story, so it's kind of hard for me to tell you much about them without then spoiling the main story a little bit. But the characters themselves do have a pretty solid personality, and they will talk back and forth, etc. as you explore the tower. And for what is essentially a shorter dungeon crawl, I think they did a pretty good job of bringing these characters to life. Now, from here, let's talk about combat, which, as you might imagine, is a pretty big part of this game. Now, as you're exploring the tower, you're going to see groups of enemies, you'll run into that group, and then it's going to take you to a combat arena, which is common of indie titles, to be honest. Or sometimes, instead of running into them, they'll run into you via ambushes. You'll walk into a certain area, and the enemies will ambush you. Now, the combat itself is like a weird mix of strategy, tower defense, and Diablo-like or just ARPG in general mechanics. And it's pretty unique in the sense that even though I've played a lot of games similar to this in style, I can honestly say that the combat was hard for me to get into because it was so different from systems I'm used to playing around with. Now, because of that, it actually made it pretty engaging for me personally, but I'm not sure that it's going to be everybody's cup of tea. But essentially, each combat encounter that you run into is sort of curated. It's designed in a certain way. There are occasionally battle objectives, so rather than just kill all the waves of enemies that are going to be coming at you, sometimes you have to defend certain things on the map. If you get ambushed, you might need to break some of your characters out of cages, for instance. Basically, a lot of the combat comes down to controlling the battlefield via sort of tower defense mechanics, because if you don't, it's very easy to get overwhelmed, as you will only have 4 characters in combat at any given time. Now, before combat actually starts, you'll be given a breakdown of the enemies. If you have characters available to you, you can actually just freely swap them out. And if you lose combat, you can just restart the combat. The game saves pretty often, so you're not going to get stuck or anything, really. But just, again, on epic difficulty, I found this very challenging, actually. But one thing in particular that I did want to draw attention to specifically was the sort of drawn abilities. Some abilities will have an area of effect, but they will allow you to actually define that area yourself. You'll be able to click the ability and then sort of draw where you want it to happen. And then that's how it'll work. And I think this is really cool for a game like this because it allows you to explore things strategically that wouldn't be available otherwise. For instance, one character can throw up a stone wall and they get to pick the shape of that stone wall. So it's very possible to just encircle enemies with it and kind of force them to stay still while you deal with other enemies, for instance. So those abilities in particular I found opened up a lot of strategic options, which made the game pretty compelling. Now, I will say that, again, especially on normal, there does come a point where the strategy part just isn't really necessary outside of boss fights. But beyond that, the combat is a very unique blend of a lot of mechanics I've seen elsewhere. But I don't think it's going to be everybody's cup of tea. Now, one thing I did want to leave on before we move on is something that affects combat but is not directly related to combat, and that is the choices. So each of your 7 characters has an alignment. However, their alignment is basically how much they like you, the character technically controlling them. So occasionally choices will actually come up throughout the game, and you'll be able to pick. And some characters will like certain choices, other characters will like different choices, and this affects their alignment or how much they like you. And if characters don't like you, then using them in combat actually gives you detriments to your combat effectiveness based on a stat associated with that character. For instance, one of them might affect attack speed, the other might affect an attribute, something like that. So using characters that like you is usually better overall. That said, the actual choices themselves are pretty superficial. They don't really affect anything outside of just that, so I wouldn't really worry about it too much if you just want to min-max it a bit and favor the characters that you actually plan on using. So from there, let's talk positives, negatives, and wrap this thing up. So on the positive side, as I mentioned, the story is surprisingly good, like better than a dungeon crawler really has any right to be, in my opinion. The exploration of the tower is also pretty good. Each level of the tower is pretty extensive, has several side quests. Some involve some stuff you can figure out, but nothing that's really going to keep you there for egregious amount of time or cause you to get stuck, etc. I really enjoyed the exploration. I think they did a really good job with that, especially especially with the environments actually, because as you descend deeper into the tower, there's a very noticeable tonal shift from level to level as you go deeper. And I don't want to spoil it here, but truthfully, you might have seen some of it in the footage, but it's very, very cool. And the other thing was the great difficulty scaling. While epic difficulty, again, was a challenge for even someone like myself who does this all the time, there are so many options to tailor the difficulty to wherever you feel comfortable. And I always enjoy seeing a game that has tons of difficulty options for everyone, basically. And I think they did a great job with that. Now, on the negative side, it's a very linear experience, as you might imagine, as you're basically exploring dungeon floors and then you're going down. So in that way, the game's very linear. There's no real choices that actually affect the story in any meaningful way. And the other negative I wanted to mention is that the voice acting is noticeably bad. And not in the way you might be thinking, where like they don't sound good or whatever. It actually sounds like the voice acting is not being done by a human being, but rather like those AI generated voices that can read lines of text on a page or something. Sometimes that's what the voice acting sounds like. And it can be a little jarring at times, especially when the game's going over something that's supposed to be pretty serious. So something to keep in mind. Now, for a conclusion, you can pick up Tower of Time for $25 on Steam. And in my opinion, that's a great price for this game. I think this game is surprisingly good for what it is. I think you can have a good bit of fun with it, especially if the combat seems interesting to you. But I would say, even if this game does not seem like it's up your alley, what I would actually recommend you do in that case is buy it on sale and just experience the story on story mode. Because again, this game's story is surprisingly good. So if you can find this on sale for like $10 or something, even if it doesn't look interesting to you, I think people should check it out for the story if nothing else. That is pretty much all I've got for you guys today, and I certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that typical YouTube jazz. I review games after 100% all the time, so if you enjoyed this, there's more coming, there's more on the channel, you're more than welcome to check out. But regardless of any of that, truly just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.